My name is Lisa Sharland. I'm the Deputy Director of Defence Strategy and National Security and Head of International Program here at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We're doing things a little bit differently this year with the Women in Defence and Security network profiles that we've had of women over the last few years. Traditionally, we've been publishing these on our website, and we thought it would be great this year to undertake a few video interviews with some amazing women and explore what they've been doing in their careers in defence, international affairs and national security. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Wing Commander Angeline Lewis, who has joined us for a chat about her fascinating career. She started out as a legal officer in the Royal Australian Navy. She then transferred across to the Royal Australian Air Force. She has deployed numerous times overseas in the Middle East, including with the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. She has 2 doctorates, one in international law and one in sea power history. She's published a range of peer-reviewed research, and she has also just concluded her role as the Defence Minister's Fellow in Women, Peace and Security. So we've got a lot to explore, and I'd like to start, Angeline, by welcoming you to the interview today. And I thought maybe we could start with hearing a little bit more about what the fellowship looked like. You were the inaugural fellow, so you're the first one who's taken up this role, and how that fits in with your career in the ADF and within the Air Force.
Thanks so much, Lisa, particularly for your kind introduction. I'm really keen to talk about the fellowship because it was a fantastic opportunity. When it was set up in early 2017, 2018, it was a personal initiative of the then Minister for Defence, Senator Payne. And what she envisaged was creating a conduit between cutting-edge academic research on the one hand and ADF operations on the other hand, so that we could feed in their experience to what we were doing for gender and military operations, but also feed back into academia our experience as military personnel on deployment. So part of my role over the first 2 years of this part-time fellowship was to create a framework for what the fellowship might look like on an ongoing basis. So I served in 2018 and 2019 part-time at UNSW. I put in my report to Defence and to the Minister. I've given them a whole range of options for where I think the fellowship might go, and certainly Defence is particularly enthusiastic about continuing this, so stand by for more on future fellowships.
I think a lot of people are looking forward to hearing more about the fellowship and what has come out of it, and I know you've published some stuff with ASPI while you've been the fellow, which we've been delighted to have as part of our Women, Peace and Security series. Moving to a bit of a different setting, on your deployments overseas, what did you find were some of the more challenging aspects of those deployments? And from that, is there any advice you'd offer for women who are starting out in their careers, either within the Defence Force or who might be looking to gain some experience in operational environments overseas?
It's a really good question. I'm going to offer something that I think we don't talk about enough. And I'm going to say that the greatest challenge from my first deployment through until my last is dealing with fear. So fear because I've been entrusted with a role that people depend on. Can I do that? Can I live up to it? Fear for the environment. What's war going to be like? Can I live with that? Will I come home at the end? And the challenge in dealing with fear is recognising which fears you can control and that you just have to overcome and move through, and then the fear that you can't control, and the only thing that you can do with that is accept it. I think the greatest challenge for not just women deploying early in their careers, but for anyone deploying earlier in their careers, is accepting that you're going to be afraid, and that's okay, because courage is how you deal with that. I'm sceptical of anyone who tells me that they've never been afraid, that they weren't afraid on their deployment, because I think they've missed a really important opportunity to learn something about themselves. And I felt that from my first deployment in 2007, where I was a very junior officer sent to be a liaison officer in Iraq with responsibilities to the ADF, to the coalition, to the Iraqi people. And as recently as my last deployment, which was my 5th to South Sudan, where I was the Gender and Protection Advisor for the UN Force Commander there, it's consistent. You've got to deal with it, but it's challenging.
I think it's useful for people to hear that, because perhaps they think that oh, they're the only one who might be or have fear going into an environment like that. So I think it's really important, as you say, to be talking about that and what that looks like to move through that as part of that experience. One of the areas that your research is focused on, and I guess this is part of the fellowship, is what women, peace and security looks like in a civil military environment. You've had experience serving, as you just mentioned there, as a gender and protection officer in the UN mission in South Sudan. Where do you think things are going at the moment in terms of how Defence or the Australian government engages in this space? What do you think is one of the key challenges moving forward? And I do note that you are still serving, so that you'll have to, I guess, be somewhat cautious about how you frame that. But would be interested in your thoughts, given the academic analysis you've applied to that. What do you think are some of the key challenges that we're really facing as we move beyond 20 years of women, peace and security?
You know, Lisa, I don't think I need to be cautious at all, because this is something that Defence is exploring in a lot of detail, and so is the Australian government. We've got a very advanced National Action Plan, have a very advanced Defence Implementation Plan, but I think we've come to a crossroads for WPS as an agenda. So now let's take that out of the Australian specific context and understand WPS as a civil military endeavour, because in the last 5 to 10 years of implementation, we've moved very strongly to a military phase. We've looked at what gender means for military operations. We've looked at how militaries integrate gender considerations into planning and deployments. But really, when we come to the military role, then we've failed at the WPS agenda, because WPS is primarily about avoiding conflict and rebuilding post-conflict. If we focus too much on that tiny window in the middle and the military's role for that, then we miss the contribution of our civilian experts, our civilian agencies, both government and non-government, our police forces and a whole range of others, to avoid the need for the military to become involved in this at all. I think our challenge for the next 10 years is to bring it back to those other key pillars, the participation pillar, the post-conflict rebuilding, women's security interests in the pre-conflict phase, and not focus exclusively on how militaries deal with gender issues in the middle of an armed conflict.
I certainly agree with you on that, because I think for a long time there has been a focus perhaps on that protection aspect and what's required there, and not so much on the conflict prevention and definitely women's participation, which we know remains an ongoing area of concerted effort. I'm curious, given the experience you've had in academia, which sounds quite extensive from the work that you've put into that over the last few years, how do you find your experience in the military informs your academic work and writing? And I think this would be of interest to anyone who's engaged in sort of professional military education. There's a real sense of encouraging people to write at the moment. How do you find that your experience in the ADF has informed your academic career?
It's an opportunity for balance. In the ADF, we tend to focus very strongly on practice, on practitioners' viewpoints. Perhaps we don't think as deeply about what we're doing or why we're doing it or how we're doing it, if we're doing it ethically, than do our counterparts in academia. But at the same time, an academic discussion that's not connected with what war is actually like, the chaos that you experience on the battlefield, the difficulties of post-conflict rebuilding, then it's very difficult for it to have a practical application. So I've been fortunate to have had the opportunity to have a foot in both camps, to both research and think, and then to apply that research in our operations.
So with that in mind, because I think from people having a chance to hear from you today, your career is going to be incredibly inspirational to a number of people. But who inspires your work? Who do you look up to?
There's been a lot of people over the years, individuals who I've really admired, and it's hard to narrow it down to just one. So I'm going to pick a hypothetical, because what I really admire is perseverance in face of adversity. So I've been fortunate to travel around the world, and I want to draw a picture that I think many of you, many of the listeners will have seen, and it's the woman who sits by the roadside in any one of 100 countries in the world with a basket of fruit or veggies from the garden in front of her. And she's got a tough lot in life. All she can do, she sits there in the hope that someone will buy the vegetables. But she keeps on with that every day. And I think there's something really admirable in that, because if we don't value and admire ordinary life, then there's no such thing as an extraordinary life to inspire us. So if my work can contribute in some very small part to valuing the role of the everyday woman in global society, then that will be an enormous achievement for me.
I think that's something for all of us to look up to, because sometimes we aspire to those people we see in the media and those types of things. But as you point out quite rightly, those ordinary folks who aren't in the spotlight, who don't necessarily get that attention, there's a lot that can be drawn from that. So I really like that response. I guess on a more informal note, to conclude our chat, at the moment, given sort of you've obviously invested quite a bit in your academic work, what are you sort of reading at the moment, and are there any podcasts that you listen to? Because I think some people would be curious to know if there are things that you do in your downtime that you find inform the way that you go about your career and the different types of work that you're involved in.
What am I reading? Well, I've got 2 books on the bedside table at the moment. One's daytime reading, I have to say, and that's Michelle Jarvis and Serge Brametz's work on prosecuting conflict-related sexual violence at the ICTY. And it's a really interesting study in perhaps conscious, perhaps unconscious legal and social obstacles to why we don't prosecute sexual violence as an international crime in anything like the same way we prosecute other physical violence. So that's there. The other thing which is really interesting is a biography of Johnson Bihari, who is a British soldier who was awarded the Victoria Cross for extreme valour in Iraq. He grew up in Grenada in a poor family. And this is his story of how life took him from Grenada to Britain to the UK to southern Iraq and then to the VC. It's really an extraordinary story, and I'd highly recommend it.
I will have to make a note of that. And do you find you tend to read more non-fiction than fiction books? I must admit, I'm personally, I find reading other people's stories quite interesting in terms of the way that they, I guess, make you think about the world.
I confess I'm personally invested in trashy airport novels, but now that we're not travelling, there's not so much time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. So we've probably adapted our reading habits a little bit in the current world environment that we're in at the moment. Look, Angeline, we could talk to you about a lot more, but thank you so much for joining us today, and I think sharing some insights that a lot of people are going to find not only inspirational, but really take away in terms of what they do in terms of their careers and really affect, I guess, change in the work that they're trying to do. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure.